My name is Thomas Aksnes, and today I will be talking about how to use SCIO with a methodology aiming at completely solving health problems. So we have developed a quite comprehensive methodology to use this wonderful technology to the fullest, and that is what I will be showing you today. And I was actually up all night before I came here making screenshots of panels on the SCIO so that we can see them more easily here on the screen. Zooming them a little bit. Yeah. I see a lot of new faces here. By the show of hands, can you show me how many of you are involved less than a year with the SCIO? Okay, very good. And I also see a lot of experienced SCIO users, and I'm really honored to also have Professor Nelson here during this talk. The last 20 minutes, Professor Nelson will come up on stage and give a presentation of something very exciting. So I will reduce the 2 hours by 20 minutes. What I want you all to know is how extraordinary you all are. And it's not just because of the way you're helping people and the way you've chosen to help people using quantum biomedicine, using the SCIO and Eductor, but also because as human organisms, you are really the perfect system, the perfect self-regulating system. There's no machine that can resemble the wonders of the human organism. At all times, there are millions of processes going on in your body. So when you think of it, how often does really something go wrong? Well, this goes wrong. Let's see if it... Oh, there we are. So even the people who are really ill all the time, they still have millions of processes that is functioning right, even though something is not working right. And it is really rare that these mechanisms go wrong if we look in percent of how many processes are going on at all times. So the human organism is really, really extraordinary. And that's because we have what we call an intrinsic self-regulating system. So our body can deal with things, can solve things. And it is that fact that enables us to work on the health, to improve health and optimize health with the technology that you're all using. So what is it that affects your body? The first is specific cell programming and stimulation of processes based on frequency and information. And that is not just therapeutically, that's also what is going on intrinsically. So through our self-regulated mechanisms, things are regulated quite to perfection. But also externally, through therapeutic technologies, we can tap into these mechanisms, we can stimulate the self-healing and self-regulating mechanisms using the same type of approach as our body does intrinsically. So I would say that this is the most natural form of medicine, even more natural than what we call natural supplements, because this is really the way that we are working with the natural intrinsic mechanisms in the same way as our body does. There's also external exposure that can influence these mechanisms in a negative way. Electromagnetic radiation of different kinds. I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's also a factor that can have an influence on the organism. The second is overloading the self-regulated mechanisms. Then we're talking about factors that are not specifically triggering anything, but it's just overloading our ability to deal with problems. And there can be major strain factors, factors that are so profound that it really, really by itself can create problems. What happens then is that we don't get the capacity to deal with every other imbalance or every other challenge because of this profound problem. And also too much strain factors in total. So the sum of all the little things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these aspects before we go into navigation on a SCIO and which panels and how to use, because I want you to understand a little bit the philosophy first. And it's not just about illness, even though what we focus on is solving profound health problems where conventional medicine struggle to solve that, where also alternative medicine in the classical forms struggle to solve it. But with this approach and this technology, we can also work with the other side of the scale of optimizing further to make sure that our clients can have a better quality of life in every aspect and to have more energy to be on top of things, to be able to do more. But also for the self-regulated mechanisms to have the capacity to deal with new challenges so that we can prevent health problems from developing. And it's also about having the energy not to just be one of the sheep, but to be the wolf that stands out and can have fun, to be extraordinary. So good health, in principle, to break it down in very simple terms, is quite simple. One is to make sure that your self-regulated mechanisms are not overloaded by too much negative influence. And the second is to solve existing health challenges, things that has manifested to the point where we need to aid the human organism in solving this. And then to focus on finding and removing the causations and to help your own mechanisms solve the problems in the most natural way, using the SCIO or Eductor. I wanted to share just a little bit about my background. I have been involved with the QXCI and then the SCIO for almost 14 years now. But the reason why I got into this in the first place is that I was really ill when I grew up. And it started when I was about 8 years old. I was drinking a liter of milk every day. And I understand that Igor told you a little bit about milk, so I think this is a good example. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here because I was finishing my slides. But this milk gave me a lot of mucus buildup in my respiratory system. And what happened is that my parents took me to the hospital to have this checked. And my mother is the head of research for the blood department at the hospital, so she had really good access there. And they said, this doesn't sound like asthma or any illness, but let's try some asthma medication, maybe that will help. And in about 2 to 3 weeks, I actually developed asthma. And now it is on the packaging label of the Ventolin that it's one of the most common side effects is that it can create asthma, and this is an asthma medication. It's like that with a lot of medications, like epilepsy medication. It's one of the most common side effects is to stimulate epilepsy. But what happened is that when I was taking this drug, it helped there and then, but it also manifested the problem even more. So I started developing more and more chronic asthma. I had to spray myself more and more. And after a couple of years, I had broken down the mucus of my respiratory system so much that I started getting infections. And these infections, then what do? You take antibiotics. And apparently, according to the hospital, I've had like 200 grams of antibiotics, which is really extreme. And then what happens? And this is a good example of that whole cascade of how people ruin their health through the conventional methodologies. So what happened then is that it broke down my bowel flora completely. And you know, in a healthy body, you have 10 times more microorganisms than cells. So to mess with these microorganisms that are supposed to be there is not the best approach. So then what happened is that it broke down my immune system, and it got to a point where I was so sick that my doctor said that, I'm sorry, Thomas, you will have to live with this now for the rest of your life, because it has developed to the point where there's no return. And I'm so happy that he told me that, because that was my wake-up call. That's when I understood that I need to find out about this myself. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a family of really top-renowned, hardcore scientists in the fields of physics and chemistry and technology and medicine. So what I learned when I grew up is that if there is not a solution to a problem, then that's wonderful, because that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity to solve it. So that began my journey trying to find out how I could fix my own problems. So I started reading about alternative medicine, and I read hundreds of books in about 2 years. What I found is that the philosophy of alternative medicine is so wonderful. The philosophy of supporting your own mechanisms, it really appealed to me. But a lot of times, when a problem is as profound as it was with me, and I guess with a lot of your clients too, the traditional old Chinese methodologies and the traditional alternative medicine methodologies may not be enough. Or at least there's a need for a whole combination of them. And that is also what is so wonderful about the SCIO and Eductor device, is that you have all these different methodologies, and that you can work more specifically instead of just doing some sort of influence to make your body start healing and regulating. So I started looking up research teams around the world and basically learning from them about their ground research. And for some reason, it took me several years before I finally found out about the development of this technology. But I would say that is the most important discovery, and it is today and it has been ever since, our most important technology. So at the time, I really grew to love this quote that I wanted to share with you. In times of change, the learners will inherit the earth, while the learned will find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. So we had to find new solutions. When conventional medicine, when traditional alternative medicine couldn't help me and the likes of me, then we had to go different routes, which is what Professor Nelson did. And you can imagine this is not just a long road, it's even a road that you have to create, because at the time there was even no education. So let's talk a little bit about what you can do for your health and the health of your clients. I mentioned two parameters. One, make sure that your self-correcting mechanisms are not overloaded, and there's a lot of factors there. And of course, the common name for this is lifestyle. And with the lifestyle, there's a lot of very important factors, but I would say the most important that we have found to be the most profound is diet. And diet is about certain things that may need to be avoided. It's certain things that you may need to add in your diet. And some people even have a third problem with overeating, what we call the seafood diet. I see food and I eat it. Hippocrates, the founder of medicine, he's very known for his quote, let food be thy medicine, and also, first do no harm. I think that he would turn around in his grave if he knew that we acknowledge him as the father of medicine today, because the way allopathic medicine is done today is not according to his principles. And he was also all about the lifestyle. He said, illnesses do not come upon us out of the blue. And this is 500 years before Christ. This is quite some time ago. They are developed from small sins daily against nature, and when enough sins have accumulated, illness will suddenly appear. So that information is not new. It's even the whole foundation of medicine. It's just that a lot of people seem to have forgotten in 2,500 years or so. It's a long time. It's easy to forget, right? So these other factors, there's a lot of radiation exposure. Exercise is important. Of course, mental and stress, that's also a factor where the SCIO is extremely good when it comes to dealing with this. The water quality and quantity. Toxins, of course. Sleep. That's where I struggle the most, because my work and my life is so interesting that I don't find the time to sleep a lot. But it is about the whole sum of everything, so I make sure that I do everything else as right as possible so that I can sleep a little bit less. And then the last factor, environment. I just wanted to show you quickly something that we've done also on that aspect. And this is just an example of how you can use ancient wisdom combined with new technologies to not just do treatments, but also to, on a foundational basis, improve the environment that you live in. This is a building that we developed, and we're going to make clinics now in this building. And every proportion, every aspect of this house is according to the laws of sacred geometry, and more specifically what we call functional geometry, which are the aspects of sacred geometry where you can actually measure a function. And with these technologies, and also combining technologies for perfect air, perfect ion balance of air, the flow, removing all radiations, it's self-sustained with energy. So once we get these clinics up and ready, I think that will be quite profound, also building-wise. And it's also showing an example of where the future should take us, not just in medicine, but also when it comes to environment. What we expect, and we're going to do a full year of research on this when the first house is built, but what we expect is that it will actually be healthier to be inside this building than to be out in nature. And I think that will be quite profound. This is what it looks like. We already have the land, we already have the building permission, and we're going to make multiple centers like this. Can you imagine doing skiotherapy in here? So the second of what you can do for your health about solving existing health challenges, to focus on finding and removing the causation and to help your own mechanism solve the problem, that's where the technologies come in. And that is what we're going to talk a little bit more about. But it's also about finding the pieces, all the pieces of the jigsaw, so that you can see the overall picture, to really map that out, lay the pieces down, and then to work on that basis and profoundly solving the problems in every aspect of it. So we're doing that through clinics that we call health optimizing. That's our brand for the clinics. And we're building that up now as a franchise. In the regional clinics, we have medical doctors combined with therapists. In the local clinics, there's just therapists. We use the best technologies from all over the world, and the most important, of course, is the SCIO, and what we're planning is to use the Eductor in the regional clinics, and with a unique and comprehensive methodology, which is what we will be talking a little bit about. When we opened the first big regional health optimizing clinic, that was downtown Bergen, we had the mayor of Bergen do the opening speech, and we had media there, and the mayor actually said she was so proud that this whole originated in her city. This is in Bergen, Norway. Well, the process, again, broken down in simple terms. One is finding out what's not functioning right, so to do assessment. Second is to find out what the causative factors are. So why is something not functioning right? Then, to solve the causative factors and the specific problems. And finally, to stimulate the body's own self-regulating mechanisms and to restore the homeostasis. So why technology-based? Well, first of all, we need to understand that life is built up from molecules which are not alive themselves. So electron, protons, etc. are held together by electrochemistry. And all substances have a frequency pattern based on the molecular movement. And this is information that your body reacts to. So this is part of how we work as human organisms. Okay. So I wanted to give an example here with the broccoli. If you need, let's say, vitamin C, or you need some nutrient from the broccoli, when you hold that broccoli in your hand or when you put it in your mouth, the processes, the biochemical processes that are engaged in using those nutrients, first the absorption and then utilizing them in these biochemical processes, those mechanisms start up before you get it down to the intestines. It starts up just by holding it or by putting it in your mouth. So it's that information that tells your body that you're now getting these nutrients. So that even with what you eat, even with the normal biochemical processes that happen in your body, that information is what is starting up those processes and stimulating that. So these patterns, this information can be measured and it can be reproduced. So it, to me at least, makes a lot of sense how we can use also the SCIO to stimulate even with remedies, even with biochemical substances. And you should have the same response, just faster, than if you had a normal exposure to it. So in your body, each tissue has its resonance frequency pattern. We have information stored in crystalline structures. And the DNA and substances are the same in some cells with very different function. It's not the same in every cell, but there are cells with exactly the same substances, exactly the same DNA, yet they have completely different function. So it's about how it's all put together. Like here is a piece of wood from a building. Well, that is physically what this is, but what does a building look like? What function does it have? What's the architecture behind it? We cannot see that from just looking at the pieces. Like here, would a better car make a difference? It's about the driver. It's about driving the car right, not just looking at how it is physically. So this information is monitored, and it's monitored through several aspects of your cell communication. So whenever something goes wrong, then that information will change, and we will know about it because our own intrinsic self-regulating mechanisms is monitoring that information. So it's the quickest way for our mechanisms to understand that here's something we need to deal with. And that activates self-healing mechanisms. So in that sense, I would say that your body is really a perfect, completely self-regulating system, as long as the strain is not too high. So that's where the lifestyle comes in. That's where the negative influence of various kinds come in. And that's where we also have an important task to coach the clients also when it comes to lifestyle. So I mentioned cell communication. Just want to throw in a couple of aspects of that. So without a direct cell communication, this system, of course, wouldn't work. So it's not just about nerve impulses, but cells also communicate by means of flashes of light and share information using particular frequencies. There is also a cell membrane vibration that has been researched quite a lot in Russia, where the cell membranes are vibrating and creating a resonance between them, and information can be transferred using that as a carrier wave. And there's also communication between similar crystalline structures, such as water, connective tissue, where there's a direct information transfer. A friend of mine, James Oshman, has written quite a lot about that. He calls it the living matrix. So, whenever in any of the more than 200 trillion cells there is a change, then that will manifest in a physical change, and vice versa. So that's why also with this technology we can directly regulate something instead of just indirectly. As I said, the most natural and direct form of influence. So electromagnetic fields are synchronized with similar fields, and the dominating fields affects more. And we can activate actually most processes in the body that are disrupted, and we can stimulate almost any process that exists intrinsically can be stimulated externally with a SCIO or eductor. Quantum biomedicine focuses on two aspects of of the frequency-based part of this. There's also that information-based part of it. One is the frequency in hertz. It's the number of cycles per second. And that is explained well within physics. So that is not a quantum aspect. But the second one is the energy. And it was Irving Schrödinger who first defined that the orbital, which is then how far from the atom the electron is going, that is the energetic aspect of the cell, of the molecular movement. So let's say you have 5 hertz, and if the electron is going very close to the atom, compared to 5 hertz where it's going in a huge, or it's not really an orbit, but they call it orbital, where it's within most of the time, then the speed of the electron is much, much faster when you have a bigger orbital, and you have a much bigger influence on molecular structures around. So you have a bigger bioenergetic field, and this is defined by Irving Schrödinger as a quantum aspect. So hence that SCIO and Eductor is a quantum biomedical therapy device, because it also works on those energetic aspects. So it's working both on the energetic, but also on an informational level. So you have all these aspects that I've been talking about, not just frequency-based, combined into one system. And then you can have a two-way communication with the body, giving feedback on the current process. Of course, that is very important to have the feedback for what is happening. And we can trigger then self-healing and self-regulating mechanisms towards most emotional and physical stress. We can also deal with stress at a causal, a direct, a related, and symptomatic level. So what you have in your hands is really a technology that can deal with every aspect of not just how the body is functioning, how things are regulated, but also on the causative factors and the different aspects of what needs to be solved to solve health problems completely. So I mentioned that in the health optimizing clinics, we also have something called local clinics, and they are specialized quantum biomedical clinics. We do assessment with various technologies, also medical technologies, and then we do therapy with SCIO based mostly on the assessment. And whenever necessary, they will refer to the regional clinics, where there is a lot of expertise and a lot of technologies and a lot of medical technologies and doctors, which we also combine. Although what we do not do is to use pharmaceuticals, because we consider that an insult to the body. But for assessment, there's a lot of good medical technologies. Clinics also help people stay healthy. So one is lifestyle coaching, specific to the assessment and also in general. And then therapeutic devices, and also we have technologies for solving strain factors of various kinds. So a little bit more specific now about the methodology that we use on the SCIO or Eductor. Number one is to free resources and do general balancing to enable the client's self-regulated mechanisms to have the best possible capacity. And I'm going to show you some screens afterwards about which programs would fit well within that. The next is to locate the primary strain factors involved with the client's health problems and to reduce or preferably solve them. Next is to locate and remove the causation factors involved with the client's health issues, and we categorize those as both underlying factors and trigger factors. So an underlying factor, that is those are the factors that make it possible for a problem to be triggered. And the trigger factors is usually what we blame. Those are the factors that specifically trigger the problem, but probably wouldn't have been able to trigger the problem if it wasn't for those underlying situations. So I would advise you to focus on both the underlying factors and the trigger factors. 4 is to locate and remove the actual health issues. And by remove, I mean to stimulate the body's own mechanisms to remove it using the SCIO or Eductor device, and without affecting involved compensatory mechanisms. A lot of times, when something is not functioning right, we will have compensatory mechanisms, other factors that will either try to solve this or compensate for that problem. And a lot of times, those factors are perceived as a problem. And I would advise you not to focus on those problems, because then you will be working against the self-regulating mechanisms and the way the body is trying to deal with this. An example of this is something as simple as hypertension. If it is hard, if you need to apply more pressure to push the blood through the vascular system, then your blood pressure will increase. And it's a dynamic process. It will increase in the situations where it's needed to increase. So just focusing then, like they do in allopathic medicine, on taking some drug to lower the blood pressure may not be the best idea, because if you don't choose a drug that is affecting part of the causative chain, and to some extent even then you can have other problems appearing. And if you don't supply enough blood and oxygen, then your cells cannot maintain the normal cell activity, and the cells will start going anaerobic. And they will have to change their metabolism to deal with that situation of having less oxygen, and you will have a process that can lead to really severe problems. 5 is to improve the organs, the processes, the energy systems, and psychological factors involved with health issues. So not just focusing on what the client comes with, but to focus on every aspect to restore homeostasis, to make sure that it's all back to balance. And number 6 is to consider symptomatic treatment. And the reason why I say consider is that a lot of times we don't do any symptomatic treatments because we want to see where we are in the process of solving the real issue. And if you do symptomatic treatment, then you don't have that indicator in the same way. While other times we will do symptomatic treatment because you may have a client who is a bit skeptical, or they need to have a very quick experience to trust you. So sometimes to give them an immediate effect from that first treatment is what they need to experience to fully follow your suggestions and your therapeutic regime. And sometimes people would otherwise take drugs to reduce the symptoms, and then I would say it would be a better solution to use this natural approach also to help them with the symptoms. So we're going to go through each and every one of these 6 aspects. To free resources and do general balancing to enable the client's self-regulating mechanisms to have the capacity, then 1 is to pick out the relevant items in the test matrix reds, the things that come up in high. Because the things that come up in high are the things that is relevant now. And if that is relevant now, then the intrinsic self-regulating mechanisms have a focus on that now. So by solving that, you will create more capacity for the self-regulating mechanisms to focus on something else. So it makes a lot of sense to do that first. Even though maybe their chronic illnesses will not show up in red, then when you work with them afterwards, there will be more capacity for that, because you dealt with the things that were current right now. The second is order programs, like order trivector, meridian programs, scalar, also excellent programs to give more capacity for what you're doing specifically later on to have a better effect. And there's also other programs like chronic fatigue on time, and there's many programs. Yeah. So from the test matrix, I did this test the night before yesterday, and I wanted also to look a little bit into what factors are coming up on the test. And it is a subconscious response test to ongoing processes. But those ongoing processes doesn't have to be a process to deal with a disease or anything like that. It's a subconscious processing of information for some reason. What it could also be is a conscious thought process. So I can give you a couple of examples of these, but let me just go through them first. It can be energetically transferred information, and it can be real imbalances or problems which are being processed. An example here from the test that I did last night, not this night, but the night before, subconscious processing of information. I had a support call from someone right before I was doing the test, where that person asked me about sinusitis and a quick way to deal with sinusitis. So what do you think came up on top on my test 10 minutes later? Sinusitis. And that shows how amazing this tool is to pick up on those subconscious processes. At the same time, I don't have a problem with sinusitis. So then, for me, that is not what I needed to treat, but it shows how amazing it is to pick up what your subconscious mind is processing. An example of a conscious thought process is that if during the test you have a client who's thinking, oh shit, I hope cancer is not showing. Oh, I'm so afraid of cancer. Oh, my God, I hope cancer is not showing. Then statistically you're more likely to have cancer show up quite high on the test. And we tested that. And that's because there was a thought process which brings it up to the subconscious mind. And then we have the imbalances and problems which are being processed, something that is an active process towards. So with that, with those short stimuli that you're doing during the test, if there are active processes, it will also usually pick up on that. I can give an example of that too. A month ago, I hurt my knee very, very bad in a water sports accident in North Carolina. And it was actually so bad that when I had the MRI at the hospital there, they said more than 80% of the main ligament, the medial ligament, was torn off. They could see bone fragments and 2 small cracks in my knee joint. So they said, for 3 months now, you will have to be on crutches. Well, I said 2 to 3 months. You will have to be on crutches. And there's about 80% chance that you need a surgery. That was 1 month ago. And I don't know if you even have recognized that I have a small limp, but it is already quite good. because I've been working on the SCIO in combination with a couple of other methodologies almost on a daily basis, SCIO twice a week. And I could stimulate those self-healing mechanisms to the extreme. So last week, now that was right before last week I was in Iceland, right before last week, so after about 3 weeks and a couple of days, I had another scan of the knee. They couldn't find the cracks anymore. The ligament was completely connected, and the only problem now is that everything is a bit stretched and there's still a lot of blood in the knee. But what would heal in many, many months was then healed already in 3 weeks. So these natural mechanisms that we have, they can be stimulated beyond the normal healing times, which really excites me, especially when it was my knee it was so bad. But what do you think came up on the first test I did on SCIO after accident? Yeah, well, actually it was a ligament that came up first. Came up number 1 for the ligament. It's quite interesting. Chronic problems, and that is what we work with the most, they are usually adapted to as the new norm. So your body will perceive the chronic problem as normal. And when your body perceives the problem as normal, you will react to it as normal, usually on that first test. But that doesn't mean you cannot work with it. It means that you just need to search for it, and then to work with it regardless of what the number is. Yeah. Like in Norway, what we see in the clinics, we have a governmentally based healthcare system in Norway where disease care is free. So people will not seek any alternatives unless they've tried the free route. It's not free, but they pay for it through the taxes, and even if you choose different ways to go, you will still have to pay those taxes. So coming to our clinics, people have to pay after they already paid humongous amounts through their taxes. So people who do that are the people that the conventional medicine couldn't help. And usually then it is chronic because they've waited a long time, it has manifested quite a lot, but also because it is often made more chronic from the medical treatment that they have received. And usually what we see is that their problems, we have to search for it, we have to look it up. But it does really wonders when you start working with them. And that's when you can see the response. So individual reaction tests can provide some more information. And we also see that in the most chronic cases, we might have to stimulate it to activate it before we can start looking at the individual reaction tests in the most chronic cases. So then doing treatment on that, and then we can see on the individual reaction test how it is. So the other factor that we talked about with these programs that do general balancing on the universal biofeedback therapy on the menu drop-down list. With the Meridian program, the Scalar program, or the frequency program, or the Trivector programs, they're quite excellent, all of them. So here looking at the Trivector program, sometimes it will tell you to do it again. We prepare for special treatment and we start it again. Or we will get Trivector complete for today, like in this case. And we can go to the next panel to work on these that come up, which the subconscious mind have selected. So these different programs is part of number 1 in our protocol. It's the general balancing and dealing with what the subconscious mind is currently dealing with to free the resources, and that will enable better effects for what you then do afterwards. I know there's a lot of therapists who really only focus on doing that one part, and that's fine. If that is what one wants to do, then it works quite well. People feel much, much better after doing that, and it's totally fine. But it's not how we work. We work with this to prepare for what we're doing afterwards. So the second, with freeing the resources, is of course, again, not to overload the self-regulating mechanisms. And we need to educate the client on important health factors and easy routines for a healthy lifestyle. What I did a few years ago is that I wrote a book to cover that, because it takes a lot of time to explain everything to the client. So I basically wrote a book about all the important factors for your lifestyle. And it sold 48,000 copies in Norway. And I'm now going to make it also in English, but currently it's only in Norwegian. I think we're only 3 people here who speak Norwegian. Wanted to show you a little bit how important it is, and a little bit that philosophy behind how the lifestyle ties in with the capacity for your self-regulated mechanisms to work. So you have an hereditary taint towards a problem. That's your genetic composition that tells you what problem you're most likely to develop. And then you have the total strain, and that's a sum of all negative lifestyle factors. And what you have left then is a buffer. So if you have a high hereditary taint, and you have the same lifestyle as someone else who do not have that specific hereditary taint, then you will develop that problem. But there's actually no known genetic disposition or hereditary taint that automatically gives a disease. That has never, to my knowledge, been documented. So even if you have a very, very high disposition genetically, you can still have the capacity by maintaining a good lifestyle, by helping the body maintain a good homeostasis, regular SCIO treatments, lifestyle. On the other hand, if you have a very poor lifestyle and you don't do any measures to improve the balance, the homeostasis of the organism, then you might have as little buffer as the person with a high hereditary taint. Just that now you can develop any type of problem, not just that one. And then what happens is that when you get exposed to something new, like this is a bacteria, or it could be, let's say, the flu virus. You get exposed to that and suddenly you get the flu. So why did you get the flu? Was it the flu virus? Well, that was a trigger. But the reason why you got the flu is that your body didn't have the capacity to deal with it. Because as human organisms, dealing with the flu virus is very simple. We should not get the flu from getting exposed to that virus. It's just when we've consumed all that buffer, when we don't have capacity to deal with it, that's when you get the flu. So nothing happens when you get exposed to the same. And I wanted to show you also a little bit how symptoms correlate. Because what we hear a lot from clients is that we give them an advice to make a change in their lifestyle, and they say, well, you know, I tried that, I didn't feel any difference, or I don't feel different whether I eat a hamburger or I eat an organic salad. I can't feel the difference. Or it doesn't matter how much I use a mobile phone because I can't feel it. Well, that is because most people don't have the capacity for the symptoms to be generated, because it is your body that creates the symptoms. It's not what you're exposed to. It's your body telling you that, you know, don't do this. But you need the capacity for your body to be able to tell you that when there is a lot of imbalances going on. So most people, this is the scale of the strain, the lifestyle, and most people, they have a lot of imbalances and a lot of negative influence. They may not have any illness, and what's happening then is that you don't have the capacity to have symptoms from every little thing. You will only have symptoms from the big things. While the problem, the disease development, is usually far worse than what the symptoms are then telling you. And as it continues, then of course the symptoms will also come. But I think what's interesting also here is that once you have capacity for your body to create the symptoms, and you have a healthy lifestyle, then all of a sudden you get more symptomatic. Has anyone here become more symptomatic after you changed and improved your lifestyle? Yeah. That. Hmm?
It's like the smoker who gives up smoking and gets a puff.
Yeah.
The body is now able to produce it.
Then they can be focused on other things, yeah. So, because you should, whenever you're exposed to something negative, your body should tell you. So if you're asymptomatic about that, then you have quite a way to go to get things in balance. So we need to explain this to clients when they're not motivated to make a change. And a lot of times what we will do is, instead of telling them to make a change, let's say we find out that they react negatively to gluten, or A1 casein, for example, in cow milk. Then telling them you can never ever have gluten or milk again in your life, they are not motivated to do that. It's impossible, at least with Norwegians. But what you can tell them is that, give them a challenge. Tell them to do that for 1 month. Ask them, can you do that for 1 month? And then we retest you, and then we see what impact that made. And most people, they manage. And also when it's a challenge, they manage completely. When it's something they believe they have to do the rest of their life, they cheat. So that's a good approach to it. And we've seen that because we have clinics in quite a lot of countries now. And it's the same in every country that we are involved in, that we have to give them that challenge of doing something for 1 month and then seeing how it goes. And we also tell them that you will have better effects from the treatments when you do this in the treatment period. And of course, they want to have more value for their money also for the treatments, so that's when they do it. And what happens then, when they get everything in balance and they feel so much better, and we see how much impact that made, then usually they suggest to stick to it. Then they will say that, oh shit, I don't think I want to go back to eating gluten or whatever it was, because they have experienced then and they have seen what impact that made. And they usually stick to it when they made the choice and you didn't make it for them. So the second, to locate the primary strain factors involved with the problems. So some examples here is things that they need maybe to fix themselves. Like if they're drinking Coca-Cola or acidic water or something that has an impact on their pH, they might have to make a change there to drink proper water and enough of it. Maybe they expose themselves to a certain toxin from food or from the environment. These are changes they will have to make. Abnormal radiation exposures, it's a lot of things people can do to limit their exposure to radiation. Mold fungus and airborne mycotoxins. When they have a lot of mold in their house, if you're just going to fix that on the machine, they will be coming back again and again and again and again, and you have to work on the same things. But once you remove some of the primary causations, then you can have a permanent fix, which is what we should all aim at. And that I want to say, what we recommend and our focus is always to have a complete fix so that they don't have to come back too often. We want to have them come back maybe once or twice a year just for a health checkup, just to see that they're still on track. So we want to help them first get completely well and then to stay well. Some people, they don't want to make any changes, so they want to come back sooner, and that's fine, they can. But what we experience is that to have enough clients in the clinics, it's all about results. Marketing, at least in Norway, we're not even allowed to do that. Some clinics still tried a little bit, and nothing really came out of that. What brings clients is results. So I would advise you to have full focus on getting good results with the clients, and don't think about, wanting to keep them. What you want is to fix them so that the word of mouth will bring you a lot of other clients. And we have waiting lists in the clinics. We don't do any marketing for our clinics, and we have waiting lists in all of them, just because of the results. And it's also an ethical, of course, thing to focus on. Get the results. Well, dental fillings, sometimes they have to go to the dentist to have something fixed. And there can be many other factors too. Certain medications, they might have to make a change. But sometimes there's something they have to do too. But then it's about locating and removing the primary causation factors, which we can also do through therapy. And we have underlying factors, such as unresolved emotional factors. That's a big, big category, emotional traumas. For that, we use SCIO in combination with conversational therapy. We find that dialogue to be very, very important when doing that treatment. The treatment works by itself, even if the client is sleeping, but when you can do the right combination, it works even faster and better, because then you involve both the conscious mind through the dialogue and the subconscious mind through the treatments. Mercury or other toxins, we use SCIO for detox. Sometimes we use something in addition so that they won't throw up and feel horrible afterwards, and so that we can do more detox. But we can also just extend the number of sessions. Acidosis and reduced cell metabolism. It's difficult to restore function if the cell metabolism is not right and if the bioterrain is not right. If there's an acidosis and hypoxia, we need to work on those factors on a cellular level also. Sometimes vaccines and medications can be part of underlying factors. Hypochlorhydria, who knows what that is? It's when you have, when you don't have enough stomach acid. One of the medical technologies that we use for assessment is a digital pill that is measuring the stomach acid. It's called the Heidelberg test. It's a gold standard test. What we see is that this is a very, very, very common problem. People with even gastric reflux, usually it's caused by hypochlorhydria, not too much. And we are now working on a project where we're looking at correlations between hypochlorhydria and food intolerances. And there's so many people who have food intolerances who have adverse reactions to something they eat. And we've looked into why do they have these adverse reactions to food. What we found is that they usually react adversely when they don't break it down properly. So if there's something you're not breaking down, then you should have an adverse reaction. It's your body's way of trying to deal with that. An example of that is the example I just used with gluten and A1 casein from cow milk. Because what can happen is that if you don't have enough stomach acid, the pepsin won't work. That's the enzyme in the stomach that will do the first breakdown of these proteins. And then what happens is that the protease enzymes from the pancreas that will do the second part of the breakdown cannot break it down in the right way. So it's broken down to partially broken down proteins called peptides. And these peptides, they can be perceived by the body as neurotransmitters. So the partially broken down proteins, your body needs to deal with them somehow. And people can have different reactions. Some people will have an IgG reaction to it. So you will create IgG that once this goes through the intestines, it will wrap in these peptides, and then you will be able to detox it and get it out of the system. The disadvantage of that is that it's a very energy-consuming process, so people get very tired and fatigued from that process. The other disadvantage is that that mechanism is really there to deal with viruses in that way. So you will have less capability to deal with viruses. What sometimes happens is that you do not have that IgG reaction, and then it can even penetrate the blood-brain barrier. And there are several studies done at the Rikshospitalet, the Reichshospital in Norway, by Professor Carl Reichelt, who found that it can be one of the primary causations for ADHD and for depression and a lot of other illnesses. So a lot of times that is a factor we also need to deal with. And it's usually caused by hypochlorhydria. And a lot of times when people have intolerances, once that is fixed, they don't have any more intolerances. That's quite common. So it's an important thing to look at for food intolerances. Of course, changing the diet works too. And there should be a combination where you eliminate the things that are bad for you and make sure that you can eat what's good for you. And there's many other factors. So going into the panels here, if we start by looking at the first category about the emotional factors, then of course a primary program is the NLP Emotional Growth Stress Reduction panel. What we found is that before going into that panel, a lot of times it can improve the effects here by first working on the brainwaves. So if we first go to the electrophysiological oscillation program here, and then do the test here for the brainwaves, and then we get a lot of values here and here. This is kind of the mode that we want the client to be in for the rest of the treatment. And if we want to work with emotional traumas, we suggest to stimulate theta waves, because you have more access to deal with the emotional traumas. You have more access to work on them if they are in a predominant theta mode. So that means stimulating here, but it also means that you then have to have a very calm way of speaking to the client. They need to be very relaxed, and you don't talk to them about funny things and lifestyle and other things when you're doing this. Then you're into the more conversational therapy mode. You can learn a lot from hypnotherapists on the way of talking to them. If you're going to treat phobias and it's stress, then alpha is usually the best to put them in a predominance of that. And on this side, we have had really, really good effects from this program, balancing the brainwaves and also measuring with an EEG what effect this has. And here we want the numbers here that are higher than normal, we want them to be less than normal. Preferably more than 10 less, but at least to make them less than normal. So you treat the ones that have the highest numbers and are higher than the normal, and also the mode. And we use this one, stimulate brain with waveform clicked 2 minutes. And once you've done all the high ones, we go to the yellow panel and do the brainwave tune for emotional stress, if that comes up. But we work on this first, and then this one, and then this will retest the whole thing. And sometimes you then have to redo some of these programs. You might get a new normal, but you also get new numbers. And you never treat the normal, you treat the ones that are much higher than normal. Those are the aberrant patterns. So after 1 or 2 or 3 times maybe in this panel, that's when we go to the emotional panels. And first then to go to unconscious reactivity. And if you know what type of problem you want to work with, let's say it's anger or anxiety or something, then you can double click on that and go to unconscious reactivity from here, instead of doing it outside on that side before this panel. And then when we get to the unconscious reactivity, we put in the age and we do the start. Work on the treat emotional profile above, while also through the conversation dealing with what is here. And then afterwards we do the disease path. We may do the disease type first, and we'll get additional factors. These additional factors, we can work with them one by one. So here you can double click directly on them, and what we advise is to talk to them about what happened when you were 13. Like, this is my test, and 13 came up. And I know exactly what happened when I was 13. I'm not going to share that, but, but people usually know, and it's usually very relevant what comes up. And if they don't know, then you just treat it, of course, until you get it rectified. But if they do know, we have seen that we can solve things faster and better if they're also mentally engaged in that process. And once you've done all of them here, then we use the treat profile for time set it right. You can set it to a couple of minutes. We usually use 3, but depending on how much time we have left. And also repeat it if it's not rectified. Then, and here was the other unconscious reactivity panel. And then this drop-down list up here. There's a lot of programs here. And these programs, some of them are really, really magnificent if you look at them in an oscilloscope. This is usually the programs I use to demonstrate when I want to show people what the patterns look like on an oscilloscope. But they're also really effective. So we advise to do these other parts first and then to go into here and use all the programs that is relevant. Only the relevant ones, but there can be a lot of them that are relevant. And these are quite effective. There's also now some new AFE treatment, and I understand there will be even more in the next update, and I'm quite excited about that too. And then, with mercury and other toxins, then going to the homotox panel, choosing the right mode, going specifically into the organ or area that we want to deal with, write it also here for that additional hololinguistic effect. What I do want to say about writing stuff is that we in our clinics don't write too much. We don't spend too much time on writing because, of course, it works to put things in. It's a hololinguistic effect, and you have the intention effect behind it. But we believe that if you spend like half the therapy just writing things, then we have seen that the effects are usually not as good as when you spend more time on the therapy, because the device itself is so extraordinary at doing treatments that you should allow the client to have as much time as possible with that treatment. And while you are writing, they are just waiting for the treatment. So we write things when we can do it quickly, and only then. Then we go specifically into whatever it is we need to detox. A lot of relevant things often comes up here, and of course we need to have this rectified. And then to the full detox program. We also have ways to measure toxin levels, and this is by far the best detox methodology that we have ever tested. The SCIO is extremely effective when it comes to detox. But it also helps to detox the right things in the right place. With everything on SCIO, the more specific you can be, the more you can target the specific problems and the causation factors, the better. We get that rectified. And the next factors here about acidosis, reduced metabolism, and also the hypochlorhydria. There's a lot of places where we can work on that, but I just wanted to show a couple of examples. We go to the nutrition and homeopathy feedback, so just to show a variety of the programs. Then for the hypochlorhydria, this is the program that we've seen the best effects with, the increased HCl production. A lot of times you need to deal with all these other factors too. There might be gastritis involved with the problem. Usually there is. The gastritis itself will also lower the HCl production, so we need to find out what's causing the gastritis. We need to deal with the gastritis. But this is the one that specifically works on improving the HCl production. And in the same panel, we also have the other enzymes that we can work with. And we have, for the metabolism, the increased hormone therapy, where we can work on increased thyroid hormone, if that is the matter. We also quite extensively test the thyroid functions, more than just the blood tests, and we see a lot of people have difficulties there. And this device is extremely effective at regulating that, but a lot of times there are other factors involved that we also need to deal with. An example of that is that a lot of times the thyroid is struggling to maintain a normal activity because the iodine receptors are filled with heavy metals and not iodine. So if that is the case, then we need to take out the heavy metals and replace it with iodine. And there are different ways to do that. What we do is we use the SCIO to detox the heavy metals, specifically in the thyroid. And then we use a singlet iodine supplement, which is a charged atomic iodine, which can then replace the heavy metals and take the place where they're supposed to be. Lugol solution cannot in the same way do that replacement, so a lot of times that won't work. And then we will use the SCIO to regulate the activity. Yeah, just an example, when we look at the thyroid response and after SCIO treatment, just actually one treatment, but at the same time doing this with the iodine, then we can get the functions into normal. So we always test everything that we do. We find out what we need to do, and we test the effects of what we do. And that's also why I can say with 100% certainty that the technology that you're working with, it works. And it works extremely well, and it works better than any other method for most things. And we know that because we test it. Yeah. So then we have the trigger factors. Some examples: stressful situations, destructive thought forms. Again, SCIO in combination with conversational therapy, same panels as we looked at, but different programs. Exposure to harmful microorganisms can be a trigger factor. Again, SCIO therapy. For that, we use long intervals until low resonance. For most things, that is not necessary, but for microorganisms, we see that they respond better if you kind of hit it hard. Well, it depends on how profound that factor is, but if you use at least on the individual reaction test, you use either 30 seconds or 3 minutes, as opposed to just the treat. It's always about managing the time also. There's certain things you need to do during that session, and then you spread the time that you have available on those factors. So sometimes you will have more time for something than at other times. A trigger factor can be eating something that one is intolerant to. It can be lack of proper sleep. And of course, it can be many other factors too. But these triggers, we also need to work on that, in addition to working with the underlying factors. Couple of panels again. This is the stress and cortisol panel, also an excellent program. And we can work specifically and also with adrenal balance. For microorganisms, we search for them. If this is chronic, it usually doesn't show high. If it's acute, it does usually show high, but if it's chronic, it doesn't. So, but then we just search for it. Individual reaction test. We might want to do a 3-minute on it first, then do another individual reaction test. And you need to do another individual reaction test to get also the resonance values. And then to get a high rectified and preferably a low resonance, if we already know for sure if it came up in blood tests or other tests that can be trusted for that. What I do want to mention here is that a lot of times if people have a specific bacteria, then you might get a lot of things related to bacteria that will come high on the test. So you already have an indication that there might be a problem with bacteria. And you might find immune stimulants. But if it's chronic, then you may not find the exact bacteria, but you will find already that there's an indication of a bacterial problem. The autofocus app, where we can do the top pathogens, for example, there's many other programs too. What we suggest is that if you use that, then do that first and then work specifically on the microorganisms. So not just work with pathogens on this one, but it's a good way to activate the system before you work with them specifically. So number 4, to locate and remove the actual health issues and without affecting the involved compensatory mechanisms. And if the problems are acute, then a lot of times you may not have to do this, because once you fix the causations, the body will know how to deal with it, to fix it, if it's acute. But if it's chronic, then you will need to deal with it because of what I mentioned earlier, that you will adapt to the situation as the new norm if it is completely chronic. So even when you fix the causations, your body still believes that things are the way they should be. This is the new norm. So we need to reprogram, to tell the body how it should be, to stimulate those mechanisms. And even with acute, we can boost the process with SCIO, but if it's chronic, it might be essential to be able to deal with the problem at all. So we trigger the self-regulating mechanisms so that those mechanisms can fix the problem. So we're not doing a curative treatment by the definition of the word, but we're helping the body fix it itself. And the body is the best to do that. And you have the best technology to stimulate those mechanisms. And we advise to use multiple programs. Search the test matrix. And what I mean by multiple programs is that on the SCIO there's a lot of different programs where you can work on the same problems and the same organs and the same factors. What we found is that if you do several of them, you will have a better success than if you just work on one of them. So kind of hit it from different angles with different types of program, and you will have a better success. This is the one that came up the highest after my injury, and now it came up with a very low value. This was a remedy for the ligament. And even though it doesn't show high now, I still, when I now treat myself to completely restore the knee, I still search for it and I work on it, and it takes a long time to rectify. So I still respond quite well to it. But it was only the first time that it came up really high. So it can be good to make a note of things that really can make an impact and to repeat them the next time. What I also use for my knee is this program, the sports injuries program. Set the time here to maximum, it's 11. You just click this 11 times. Set double power, put the head harness directly on the knee, put in what's relevant, and work on that. And then afterwards, these AFE treatments, the SCIO, sport, anti-inflammatory and injury programs. The inflammation actually disappeared from one day to the next. So that's quite remarkable. The knee was like this, and it had the normal size when I woke up the next morning after treating it. So then it was more about fixing the ligaments and the cracks. And other programs that can be relevant in this category is here in the timed, where you have the enabled timed therapies and where you can work on specific programs. And I want to mention something we have quite a lot of experience with here. It's the blood sugar problems. There's a lot of people with insulin resistance and pre-diabetes. And a lot of times their blood sugar might be fine because they compensate. Again, this compensation, their pancreas will produce more insulin to compensate for an insulin resistance. And in average, it takes more than 10 years of insulin resistance to develop a blood sugar problem because you have that compensation. So your pancreas can keep up with this high production for more than 10 years before it gets tired and cannot do it anymore. So of course, if that is the case, you have to work on the pancreas too. If you don't have that compensation anymore, then the SCIO has a lot of programs to work on the pancreas. But if you're still in that compensating phase, so you have insulin resistance, but you're overproducing insulin to compensate, then we suggest not to treat the pancreas because it's already compensating. Then you work with what might be the problem causing the insulin resistance. One is usually the diet. Second is usually the activity on the cellular level, because if you have challenges with the cell metabolism of some sort, or there's interstitial acidosis or a problem with the bioterrain of the cells, then you will also develop much more easily insulin resistance. Stress can worsen it, so that's also why a lot of people, they will have problems digesting carbohydrates when they're stressed, but they can digest it if they're totally relaxed. So also think about, what do you do when you eat? Are you, like me, working and on the phone and everything at the same time as you're eating? If so, then you cannot have carbs. That's why I don't eat carbs, for the most part. Carbohydrates is carbs. Yeah. And then there are some programs. When you click this, and it's the same with the start degeneration treatment, you get additional programs here, and when you click the additional programs, you get yet another additional programs. And there's a lot of really good programs here, and I also have an example showing how that is. This is an insulin resistance, which is completely outside the norm, where just one session on the SCIO combined with a change of diet fixed it, and these are just follow-up tests where we didn't do anything. And we see that the impaired glucose tolerance, because in this case it was well, the doctor said diabetes, we would say borderline pre-diabetes, diabetes. But we see that it took a little bit more time. You see, the first one was fixed after that one session, but the glucose tolerance needed a little bit more time. And still, without any more treatment, the next time it was fixed, and then it stayed. So sometimes you also need to allow the body some time. And remember that when you're stimulating processes with a SCIO or Eductor, it's not just effect you have there and then. You are programming a process that will go on for some time. And you need to allow that time to happen. Another example of specific programs, the allergy programs. We've been working quite a lot with allergies, and that's usually a simple thing, an easy thing to fix when you work specifically with the allergies that they have, and when you also followed all the suggestion that comes up in the device for what you need to do to prepare for that. And in addition to working on this panel and doing here the chart and then going into the main treatments and setting quite some time there, and there you have to remember to put on the sound unless you want to guide the client in the same way as his voice is guiding with the sound on. And also this program, emotional allergy release. I also wanted to mention that as a causative factor for allergy, the most common factor we see is emotional factors, that there are unresolved emotional problems. And then we go through that whole protocol that I showed you earlier when you work with emotional traumas and unresolved emotional factors. And then before working with the allergy, make sure you use this one. So then the next part, to improve the organs, to restore their function and the state on the cellular level on the organs, the processes, the energy systems, the psychological factors, to restore the homeostasis, then that is the next part. And that can be organ-related. That's where we can work with acupuncture, chakras. We can work on that simultaneously on the body viewer. And organs, sarcodes, biofeedback, test matrix, scalar, working with the chakras, meridians, emotional programs. Then we need to restore the homeostasis. And sometimes we need to do some of these things before we're doing something else, because sometimes there's a need to do that to be able to solve some of the steps previously. So this is not always as number 5 in the chronological order, but usually to restore the homeostasis, you need to fix the problem first, but sometimes you need to fix some of these factors to fix the problem. And Sometimes there are also synergetically imbalances that should be worked with also here. But a lot of factors, when you give the capacity back to regulate, a lot of imbalances will restore automatically. So it's the dysfunctions, the problems that are so profound that function cannot be maintained. Those are the problems that kind of steal all the capacity to regulate. So people with real dysfunction, they usually have a lot of imbalances because they don't have the capacity to deal with the little things. So once you fix that main problem, there will be capacity to regulate and to fix these little things. And what we see is that a lot of imbalances just automatically, without any treatment, will be resolved once you fixed the dysfunction and the more primary factors. But sometimes they are also adapted to as a new norm, so sometimes we have to work with those imbalances too. But if you only work with those imbalances, then what we see is that you will just develop new imbalances because there's no capacity to deal with them. So it's really important to work with the profound dysfunctions and not just any imbalance. So some examples here to restore this. In this panel, there's a lot of really good programs. First is, of course, this first one, where you test and treat trivector energy flow, and to work specifically on what comes up and then to redo the whole thing. Then we have the original SAR code results, where we want the rectified to be more than twice as high as the resonance. Then we have the timed. Usually it will suggest something here. This was 10 minutes, the test after I had a support call about sinusitis, so that's why sinusitis came up also here, not just on the test matrix. But here also you work with what you know you need to work with. So I advise to work as specifically as possible, focused on the dysfunctions and the causations for that. And these programs are really effective also compared to the time that we spend. As I said, we test the effects, and we found this program to be one of the programs where you have the most measurable impact depending on the time spent. So this is a panel that we usually always use. And you can set the time here and set whatever is relevant here. There can be other relevant things than what comes up in red, in addition to keeping the ones that the subconscious mind chose. The body viewer can be used at the same time. We suggest to load individual movie program and to work simultaneously with the same things. We found that to be better than to just put in a lot of different things and let it run in the background, because we like to have focus. So if, for example, we're working with the adrenals in the main program, then we will run the adrenals here. Or if we work with the liver and a specific problem in the liver, or the enzyme production in the liver or something like that, we will work with the liver here. But if we work with the liver itself, let's say with a sarcode treatment in the main program, then we might want to do the liver meridian here. So we've seen quite good synergetic effects of combining specifically a support treatment from body viewer combined with the main programs. And with that example of the liver in sarcodes, then we would typically go to this panel and specifically choose that, select what's relevant, set the time, and to get it rectified. You don't always have time to get it completely rectified. This is from the Biofeedback program. So this I also used on my knee. This program to work on the chakras and the bioenergetic field, it's also a quick program that a lot of people who are sensitive seem to even feel, they feel good when we do that one. That's why we started to do that on most clients by the end, because so many people say that they actually feel good when we do that. And it's quick. I wanted to mention this program, that once you've started the body viewer, then we also have the special autofocus pulse that we can run, or the overall autofocus pulse. And especially if you're treating yourself in the evening after the clients, then what I could suggest is to let this and the body viewer just run until the next morning. So it's a good program to just run self-space on yourself. Of course, there are many other options for that, but this is typically what we would use for that. So, consider symptomatic treatment. I won't go in too much on that, but just remember that symptoms is our mechanism to make us aware of a problem. And if you treat the symptoms, you won't be able to monitor the effects of the other treatments that you did. But sometimes it is beneficial, especially because you can get the client to have more belief in you and the methodologies that you're using, which also is very important for them to follow your advices and to come back until the problem is solved. So this is the total 1 to 6 step protocol that we are using on the SCIO. And it would be the same protocol for Eductor. And if you have any questions, then because I want to let Desi come up on stage now, but I want to show you that I also have a website with my name.com, thomasaksnes.com, where you can click what it is you want information about. And that's the best way to ask questions and to get in contact and send that in. Yes. Okay, thank you.